This is Unfragmented, inspired by Colossians. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Join our book club as we pursue a more consistent Christian life.
All right, welcome to Unfragmented, where Lee Bortons and I explore the cohesion of things believed with things done. And today is May 18th, 2023. I'm Kevin Novak. Lee Bortons is our co-host, and we've got Julie Melendez with us here. This week, Lee is actually out. She is traveling, and I talked to her a little while ago, and she tells me quite positively that she is antagonizing some pro-voucher people. And I said, Lee, keep up the good work. So she is quite busy. And this month we're talking about Samuel Blumenfeld's Is Public Education Necessary? This month. I think I might have said this week, but this month also we're talking about Samuel Blumenfeld's book. And then next week we will be joined by Reverend E. Ray Moore. Some of you are already familiar with him. He's with Exodus Mandate. He's been around for many, many years, promoting Christian education, doing a fine job of that. So we'll have him on next week and just get some good wisdom from Ray. And then next month, we will be talking about Melvin Tinker's book. This is That Hideous Strength, a deeper look at how the West was lost. And so the subtitle here relates to cultural Marxism. And if you're not already familiar with cultural Marxism, it will be coming to you very soon, unfortunately. So you're going to need to be very knowledgeable about that. I'm actually going through an issue at work right now that relates to that. I'm thankful that I've been updated on that. Actually, my wife's book club, they had already read this, and it was recommended to me. So we'll go through that next month. And then a couple other books. We had mentioned Douglas Wilson last week, so I just want to mention this one here. It's been a while since I've read this, but if you're interested, this is called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. And I think Lee had mentioned this, An Approach to Distinctively Christian Education. So that's a very helpful book. So you might benefit from looking into that. And then finally, I might have already mentioned this on the club, but this is The Children Trap. This is by Robert Thoburn. And in the 80s, Gary North was the general editor of a series on applying the Bible to all areas of life, the Biblical Blueprint series. You can actually get this as a free PDF on, I think it's Gary North free PDF books, something like that, if you do an internet search on that. So before I open the discussion here, if you don't mind me making a mention about William Wilberforce, I was pondering this book the last couple of days, and I seem to remember, wait a minute, I think I remember Robert Owen being mentioned somewhere else. Well, lo and behold, although I don't own the book, but I had read some years ago a book by Kevin Belmonte. It's on William Wilberforce. And William Wilberforce was written about also by Eric Metaxas. I haven't read that book, but some of you might find that interesting. Eric Metaxas, by the way, is someone that he really knows a lot of big words. And he's a good author. But this book about William Wilberforce, it is called William Wilberforce, A Hero for Humanity, again, by Kevin Belmonte. But anyway, I want to make mention in there that at one point in 1812, Robert Owen had visited William Wilberforce. And, in the old days, they sat around and talked instead of watching television. So they sat around and talked with one another. And Robert Owen, according to William Wilberforce, had mentioned to him, Robert Owen had said, one of my great principles is that a person ought to place themselves in the situation of others, and that they would wish that they would be treated. And William Wilberforce's response was, is that quite a new principle, Mr. Owen? I think I have read something like that in a book called the New Testament. So it doesn't seem like William Wilberforce was too fond of Robert Owen. And maybe it was because Robert Owen was not necessarily presenting himself as a Christian. But that was before the failure of the New Harmony experiment, I think, which was about 16 years later. So I just want to make mention of that. And then one of the things that I talked to Lee about earlier, and this would be, I think, a good way to, one of the things we really should be talking about is, the title of Samuel Blumenfeld's book here is Public Education Necessary? And so, we had talked, one of the big things, of course, with classical education, let's talk about terms, let's get the grammar down. I think the last week or two, we talked about education versus schooling and the differences. And I think one of the working definitions we came up with education was it would at least include not just learning, but discipleship and sanctification. That would be inclusive of adults. So I do want to ask just initially, what are everyone's thoughts on the title of the book? It seemed when we went through the myths that Samuel Blumenfeld had put down on page 1, which were really good. I mean, they were just awesome, these 5 myths. We found out right away that it seemed like Mr. Blumenfeld was using the terms education and school interchangeably. So what does everyone think about the title of the book? Is public education necessary? Should it really be, is public school necessary?
I guess based on how we define our terms, it should really be is public school necessary? And I'll admit, thought when I was reading the book, I thought it was going to be more of a persuasive, like giving arguments as to why we don't really need public schools, and instead of it being so much more about really the history of how public education came to be.
I would almost rename it "Is state education necessary?" Because that's really what it comes down to. It's not so much about education or schooling. It's more about who it is that's running it. It's that public or state system that is really what he seems to go against the most. Education is necessary. It's who's running it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could maybe even go a little bit broader with it. Is federal education necessary? Because so much of the federal system is overseeing the state system. The states are relying on federal funds. So the federal funds and the larger federal agencies are the ones that are dangling the carrots. Well, if you want this money, this is what you have to do.
Yeah, and I think when we say state education, we probably mean like civil government, right? That's probably what we mean. But I think, Michelle, I think you're right. And I think we kind of alluded to this last week, when we looked at the myth of locally controlled schools. That's really not true. We look at what the feds do, and there could be a broader conversation here about spending. The feds spend, and they know that they can control their spending, the necessary and proper clause of the U.S. Constitution. So they spend and then they control, and we're all familiar with that. But yeah, I could see that. Michelle, what would you? I'm just curious, and I have a good idea what your answer would be, but I have to ask. I'm just curious. What do you think? Do you think general education would be better off if the feds were out of education entirely and it was basically a state? Like when we say state, I mean like state civil government system. What would you think about that?
I definitely think that the federal government needs to be out of it, and I think that the state would have could potentially have standards that they would like to see met, civilly speaking. But do you remember the very first night we talked about this book, and I was trying to remember what book we had read this year in Challenge 1 that talked about a local tutor, and it was in A Gathering of Days. And so this tutor thought that it was appropriate that he start bringing in news. I finally figured it out, that he was reading newspaper articles about things that were going on at the time, social things, and with slavery. And when the parents got wind of it, they said, that is not your job at all. And he wrote a letter to the families and apologized to them and said, you are right. This is not my role. This is something that you should be teaching your children. And my role is to teach them the English, the math, and things of that nature. So I think you would have parents having a little bit more control over what was happening in the classroom if it was state civilly run or operated by.
And you said the book that you were thinking of it's called A Gathering of Days?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
A Gathering of Days. Yeah.
And I have not read that. Is that a true account?
I don't think it is. I should have had it with me, but I think it's more as a diary. It's written. I can't remember now.
It's a fiction.
It took place. Yeah.
It's A Gathering of Days, a New England Girls' Journal, 1830 through 1832, and by Joan W. Bloss, I guess. That was a Newbery Award winner. It's one of the Challenge A books that we read.
I think in part of it, it says that she, or maybe in her acknowledgments or something, she talks about going up to New England and doing a lot of research for the book, to gather ideas, but that it's not, that it is fictional.
Oh, that it is fictional?
Yes.
Yeah, well, and it's still, I mean, the situations happen, literally thousands of times over the years where, a parent would delegate the authority. So when we talk about someone else teaching, we're talking about delegation. And in Kerry Morgan's book, he talks about in loco parentis. So that would be delegation. So where someone is acting in the stead of the parent. And so certainly that's acceptable, but it sounds like in that story, there's a good lesson there, and that the parents were still paying attention to what was being taught and also having control over the teacher. And the teacher submitted to the parents. I don't know if anyone saw this, but there was an article today that pretty much the only website I check is Real Clear Politics, just to kind of scan. Donna, I see her smiling. I don't know if you check it, but there was I can't remember her name, but who's the White House spokeswoman, KJP, I think her initials are, where she said, and they had made a comment, anyone see this? She had made a comment about how the parents, I can't remember the exact comment, but it was basically about how the parents are not the ones that are like in control of the child. And so, and again, I'm paraphrasing there, I want to be careful, but it was an extreme statement that she made. And so I think any education that we're looking at has to continue to involve the parents, and they're still accountable. That's one thing that good books on education talk about over and over, is that the parent, I would argue mainly the father, but the parents are still accountable to God for the delegation. And so they're going to one day be accountable to God. But I have not read A Gathering of Days, but that's something that looks interesting to me. I do wonder too, like, if when we talk about federal education and then state education, we have the overlap. It would be nice. I often wonder how much money we're spending on the state level just to comply with federal education laws, because we're only getting about 8 or 9% of the federal education dollars for education. And you think, I wonder if someone would study the math on it and see how much it would cost us to comply with those rules. So probably not worth it, I think, at the end of the day. So any other thoughts on, we were talking about the title of the book. Any other thoughts? Whomever made the comment about how this book seems more historical than argumentation, Nicole, that might have been you. I would agree with you on that. There's nothing, that's okay. I mean, this is a fantastic book, and I'm glad that I read it again, because as I'm reading it, I find myself thinking, I need to remember that. I need to remember that. And, but yeah, it's not necessarily about whether public education is necessary. Maybe Samuel Blumenfeld just had in mind getting people to think about it. So any other thoughts on that?
I mean, the word necessary leaves you necessary for what? So is the presupposition to go to college, to get a job? Is public necessary, they educate to become a good citizen? So it kind of like necessary for what? So that's an interesting, it doesn't completely ask.
It's open-ended, isn't it?
Mhm.
Broad. It's a broad question.
I think for me,
Yeah, because
being that was a historical book, the question that came to me when I finished reading it was more of, it's not, is public education necessary? Is it possible to redeem it and to bring it back to what parents wanted, or is it something that needs to be completely wiped away? Do we need to totally go back to the system of the Boston Masters, where there were little cottage schools with good teachers who knew how to teach, and parents choosing their education? Or even they said at one point, they said kids didn't go to school till they were 7 and 8 and able to read already. So parents already taught them a fundamental thing before they went to school, instead of just fully expecting the school to do everything. But it's really is, can it be redeemed? Which I think pairs with, is public education necessary? I think they kind of, is it necessary? Can it be redeemed? Or is it something we need to scrap?
Well, I think that's a good question. And actually, I think that really is what I was trying to drive at when I wrote my book about abolition. And that is, we need to ponder that question, because that really is a threshold question. In other words, like you're saying, Donna, we're basically trying to do education, but we're not backing up, and we're not thinking about, what should it look like? And, we're not, the fact of the matter is we're not even really able to talk about these things. I had mentioned Melvin Tinker's book, and just going off on a tangent here, but Cultural Marxism. Think of the backlash you would receive if you floated the idea publicly about merely sending your child to a public school at the age of 7 after you taught your child at home how to read. And so now, we're looking at the feds trying to get money into pre-K, and they've already done it. But we're not even really able to ponder these questions openly. You're anti-kid, or you're, anti, or you're pro-poverty, and there's backlash about that. But these are really healthy questions to ask. And I think that was really, all I was trying to get people to do is just think about, really, should there even be public schools in the first place?
And I think, there's in that it's this is talking about the roots. And I have your book on my shelf behind me. It's in the short stack to read this summer. But so I haven't gotten there yet. But I think it's just so hard. It's like, has school already accomplished what it wants? I think it's made itself necessary because it's created parents who are unable to teach their kids phonics and how to read, because all that we know is to go to an expert and do that. I mean, I can remember being thrown into a first grade classroom to teach and being like, I don't know all my phonics. I don't know it well. I'll be honest, leapfrog videos with my daughter when she was 2 years after I did it helped me more with phonics than anything I did in my teacher education. And I taught kids to read. So it's hard. You've created this system that just is self-perpetuating because I can't teach my kids. So I have to send them to somebody who's better than me and knows more than me, but I'm just sending them into the same system that created me, which can't, like, it's self-perpetuating, and that's hard.
Mhm.
And it's how do you break that cycle? Because we are so dependent on other people and other things.
Well,
Well, and I
I
think
made a
too,
note. Oh, go ahead.
I think too, in the mindset of young parents is, I've got all of these bills to pay. I have a college education that I need to pay. And I've spent all this time getting educated to do a job, and teaching my kids is not part of the equation. Having my kids, that's part, that's part of it. But to then just sort of walk away from hundreds of thousands of dollars that you are indebted to the federal government for an education, for a job, that doesn't seem reasonable. And so you do have this self-perpetuating public school system that is supposed to take care of that for you. So why not use it?
I'm paying for it anyway. Even if I don't have my kids in the system, I'm paying for the system.
Yeah, and I know my brother, with all due respect, my brother, and it's interesting because my brother is a conservative. As far as I could tell, he is not a Christian. And in some ways I can't believe I'm about to say this because I'm the most conservative person I know, but he's a little more conservative than me. And he would say to me, oh, we had sent our children to the public school because we're paying for it, and he has good kids. They're really good kids. But it's, and it just makes me think too, don't you think it's just a lot of different things, the perpetuation of the civil government school system, it's really a function of a lot of things, isn't it? I mean, I made a note here about page 116, where basically early on in this whole process, this whole history of public schools was the opportunity to make money. And so I made note of that. And, in Bruce Short's book, I think I mentioned his book last week, but he talks a lot about that. But on page 116, there's mention, but the largest support for public education came naturally from the educators themselves, who saw a centralized market for their textbooks, improved schools, and better salaries through taxes and the security and dignity of public employment. So, I mean, I think there's so many different things here that have to be fixed. And while, that can be frustrating, I do think, generationally, that's all we've got to do is just chisel away at it bit by bit, issue by issue. And then I think hopefully over the long term, we'll get where we need to be. But wouldn't y'all agree? I'm a Texan now, so I've got to say y'all every now and then. Wouldn't y'all agree that there are multiple issues here really that are just buttressing this public school system?
Absolutely. There's so many, and I love that the book said it at least twice. I know on page 200, the argument was that the end justified the means, that central education would promote the idea of freedom, when in reality it would promote the idea of national conformity. And then I lost the other page, but like it says that somewhere else. It's, the end justifies the means. Let's put our kids in this subservient, something that's not as good. And I think it even says, so page 187, all of the arguments that were used to persuade the middle and professional classes to send their children to the public schools were social in nature, since it was readily admitted that the public schools were academically inferior. We're going to send them here because the better the freedom that we saw at the end, which wasn't really what they were getting, is what they wanted. But that's not what we've got. We've got people who can't think, who don't have the academics. And that's hard.
I see what you're referring to on page 200. It was the argument that the end justified the means, that centralized education could promote the idea of freedom, when in reality it would promote the idea of national conformity.
Yeah. And that's what they've got. I mean, we have people who cannot, I mean, even that whole last chapter about the conservatives' last stand with Mann and the Masters, the 31, going back and forth in public, with public pamphlets or in newspapers or whatever form that they had, but they were going back and forth. But the public was so swayed already to Mann that they weren't listening to the people who were educating. They're like, this isn't right. This isn't going to work. This doesn't work. This new theory of education is just a theory and it's not going to work. But there's something in humans that we want the newest and latest thing. We want that newly created thing. But then we're afraid to stay with what's been working. It's like, but that's been working. That's what's true. The Bible is the truth. The Bible is the solid foundation. But we want the new and better thing. We want the Unitarian idea of whatever that new idea is. That sounds good too. Oh, that sounds better than this, So I was trying to think, because I always try when I think about human characteristics, I always try and think about, okay, we're made in the image of God. What is what is that part of that image that we're following, but we're following incorrectly? And I think that is that creativity. We want to create, we want to have new, we want to see the new and enjoy the new. But when we make something, we don't always call it good. It's not always good. Whereas when he created, it was good. And I think we need to go back to what he created.
I think what you're saying there actually is exciting to me, because I'm not sure what's on page 141, but I made a note about page 141, and the question I put down for myself was, is Christianity, meaning depravity, presented too negatively? And it's okay that not everyone's a Calvinist, because here in the book, it's kind of the Calvinists versus the Unitarians, and that's okay. Like I'm a Calvinist, but at the end of the day, I'll see you in heaven, But I do wonder, and I thought about this when we were going through George Gilder's book, because he used the word eschaton, and I thought to myself, we need a Christian eschaton, because oftentimes our eschaton, like in meaning eschaton, like a final situation. And my point here is that oftentimes, and this is understandable, because we're citizens of heaven, oftentimes we kind of see this duality of spiritualism versus materiality. Even Luther had a little bit of that in him. But I can appreciate what you're saying, Donna, because it's almost like, and I don't know if this is true. I'm looking for answers. I just wonder why at that point, when there seemed to be more Calvinists in the early 1800s, are probably more solid Christians than there are now, the Unitarians still prevailed. And I'm thinking, how did that happen? When they had seemingly I don't want to call it a system, but a private education paradigm working. And I'm not pessimistic because of that, but I am concerned. Like, how is it they allowed the Unitarians to prevail over them? And, we look at like Christianity and how it's presented. Maybe it is, and I'm just throwing this out there. I don't know for sure, but maybe it is a little too negative insofar as like here in this creation, we're not necessarily presenting it to people as something they can appreciate now and enjoy now, and it can lead to a better way of glorifying God. I'm not talking about the prosperity gospel, but just a better creation. Does any of that make sense? Because I was wondering, okay, are we just being too negative about Christianity relative to Unitarians, which seem to be a more optimistic view of mankind?
I know sometimes in the book it was referring to kind of the split was that, like you were saying, we are too depraved. Like they just don't want to believe that a 1-year-old is a sinner, or a 1-month-old, or 1-day-old, or 1-minute-old is a sinner. But if you think about it, they come out screaming and wanting for themselves. They're selfish from the beginning. We are selfish from the beginning. And I think, but people don't want to believe that. They don't want to believe that we are inherently sinners, which is different from evil or bad. It's just that we are just wanting for ourselves. We are separated from God, and we're not necessarily doing what he wants us to. So it's not that we're bad. I have friends that are better, that are non-Christians than I do. They're better people than some Christians I know. So that's not what it is, but that's what people hear when they hear that all are sinners. And I think they just think that means we're inherently evil or we're inherently bad. They just don't have the terms defined correctly. And we haven't done, I guess, a good enough job, back then or now, to correct that incorrect feeling. But no, we don't want to think people are bad from the beginning. You don't want to look at your 1-year-old or your newborn baby and think this is a bad person or an evil person. That seems wrong, and it is wrong. But that's where that disconnect, I felt, that they seem to, no, we want to believe everybody's good. We don't want to believe that people are bad at all.
Mm-hmm. What about redeeming things? I mean, if we're going to be focusing on redeeming things for Christ, we have to ask, like, can that thing be redeemed? And so that would give us optimism, right? Or at least a positive spin. I hate to sound like we're trying to sell Christianity, but like a positive spin on it, right? Like, hey, we can do art for Jesus. We can create things, and God was a creator, and so on, right? Or build businesses and be productive.
Yeah.
I know that and I don't mean this to sound superficial, but I like the idea of making money. And I know that I am toying with the possibility of sounding greedy or being greedy or feeling greedy. That I understand that. But to me, when I'm making money, I'm doing something, presumably I'm doing something that's productive, or like I'm building a fence outside right now. And I like the idea of being productive. And to me, that's a positive thing. And I guess what I'm getting at here is when I look at the Unitarians and how they were basically selling this idea of public education, it was, hey, we can improve, we can do big things here. And I got to admit, like, that's important to me. I just think it needs to be done on the Christian side. Like, hey, we can do big things. I don't know that we're presenting it that way. And certainly one of my issues, I don't want to call it a complaint, but my issues is we're not doing that for the pulpit. But I don't know about everyone else, but to me, that's exciting. Like when I think, oh, I'm repositioning my fence and I'm basically moving it forward. And Nicole's in Texas, so she kind of knows, like most people, probably not Nicole, but most people in Texas have this standard fence, privacy fence around their property because we're so close together. And I'm moving the fence forward. I'm pretty radical in that. And but I'm thinking, I joke around. I'm like, I'm taking dominion, taking more ground for Christ, and we're going to do some more gardening inside the fence and all that. And that's exciting to me. But it's not that I'm worldly, like, I'm sowing my seeds in this worldliness and I'm somehow being a sinner. That's exciting to me that I'm being able to make progress and do things for my kids and all that. So I don't know. That's what I think of, and maybe I'm the only one who thinks that, but I don't know if it's because I'm a man or because I just, wasn't raised in Christianity, but those things are really exciting to me, economics and so on.
I think going back to the redeemed question, can anything be redeemed without Christ? We can't be redeemed. We are still sinners without Christ. The only way he redeemed the cross, he take it from basically the electric chair or a crucifixion device, a way to kill criminals. And now we wear it as art and jewelry. He redeemed the cross. He's redeemed that, at least in Christians' mind, the only way to redeem anything, and that's not to say he can't redeem it through us, but I think that also goes back to our giftings and what he calls us to do. If it's my job to be a teacher, then I can redeem the education for those I teach. I can't necessarily go beyond that, but it's that exponential growth. I can teach my daughter. My daughter can then teach her kids, or she can go into a school, public, private, whatever. Hopefully she has learned enough to redeem the education for them and pass it on. It's that disciple making again, and it has to grow in that way. And that's how God's redeemed everything. He starts with one and he passes it on. And I'm in Texas too, and I have that fence.
I didn't know you. What part of Texas are you in, by the way?
Northwest Houston.
Okay, we'll talk about that later. But anyone else on that?
Well, so talking about redemption, Kevin, I remember when you did the Great Homeschooling Convention when it was in Fort Worth, and I said in one of your talks that you did, and you mentioned something about people wanting to redeem schools, and this is one of those things that stuck out with me. And you said something about comparing it to a gentleman's club, in that the people that go there and the people that take part of it don't really want it redeemed because it had a specific purpose in how it came to be. And you I can't recall exactly what you said, but part of that stuck out with me is that you said that public schools, can't really be redeemed because of the kind of people in them want it to be a certain way, as well as I think tying into the history of it.
Yeah, that's good. And I think, if we are looking at something that we want to redeem, we have to ask, does God want that to be redeemed? And in terms of civil government schools, you know, obviously, you know, you're all aware, y'all are aware that my position is they can't be redeemed because they really shouldn't exist in the first place. And and I can appreciate how the last two sentences of the book on page 214 talk about that. I think impliedly, the civil government has no more place in education than it has in religion. And one of the talks I give at homeschool conventions is about the Virginia Act for the Disestablishment of Religion. And Carrie, that is also in Carrie's book. He does a really good historical analysis of it. But in asking, you know, can this particular thing be redeemed? So that would be the threshold issue. And if everyone doesn't mind me asking this, and you know, I really want to ask this about every book that we have read so far, but with guests and so on, and the nature of good conversation having prevented this, I do want to ask everyone if anyone's willing to share a more broad question here about this book. You know, I went to college, and I don't know that it was that productive, but it was probably slightly productive, you know, but it changes you. And really what I want to know is if anyone's willing to share about this book after you've read it, how has it affected your worldview? Because, you know, we might think, oh, you know, I read another book, I'll make a note of it and move on. But, you know, when we read books, I think that it can affect us. Maybe we don't realize it until later, but is anyone willing to share like an answer to that question? How has this book affected your worldview?
For me, it's opened my eyes to something I did not know, but I was interested about. So I jumped on this month because this book piqued my interest, because I was a public school teacher. I was educated to teach in the public schools. I read The Well-Trained Mind, and I pretty much throughout my education that I still had money to pay on a loan for. And I've been in CC this year. I realized I've been in CC for 12 years now, and my daughter graduates next year. I'm working on my master's degree through CC. So, but this it gave me a different viewpoint of public education. I know where it is now. I know, but it's interesting to see the roots of it. And although there have been places and times, and even my husband's family, their cousins, and you know, they're all in a small town, and they're pretty much run the education system there. Many of them are in the education system, and they truly believe in it. And it may be a little bit different there than in Houston, where it's being taken over by the Texas Education Agency this week. So it's just, I've redeemed my education. But the question is, I mean, is it necessary? I want to yell it from the rooftops anyway. Get your kids out of the public schools. They don't work. But there's that self-perpetuating that it's so hard. And I even see that in CC. These moms, they go until they get to challenge, and then they drop out because they're just scared. They're like, that Latin is hard. I don't understand it. It's too hard, you know? So for me, it's kind of boosted what I already knew, but I got the background, which I had never heard this story. I'd be curious to hear how it goes further or from different points, because this mostly focuses on New England. Is that the only place that this started? Were there other places that public education kind of had a grassroots effort? So I'd love to delve more into it, but it just opened my eyes to, this was the purpose from the beginning, and we're getting closer and closer to that. I don't know if that's good or bad.
Well, I mentioned that book about Hagedorn. I'm not nothing against the man. I don't necessarily encourage you to buy it, but it does give a more exhaustive history about the different states and who the players were in different states. I think it's called Founding Zealots. Hagedorn, I don't remember the gentleman's first name, but I think you can get it on Amazon.
Yeah.
So anyone
You've
else who
mentioned
just
it
have
before.
another, yeah, that gives them a pretty good. It's hard to get through. Blumenfeld's a little easier because it's like a more truncated summary. Anyone else really want to share within the next minute or two we've got left how this may have affected their worldview? Jennifer, you look like you want to share.
I jumped in partway this month, so I have actually read the book, but I'm enjoying the conversation. I live in California, and you kind of mentioned like ESAs at the beginning. We have charter schools out here, and that's like I see that being a really big hurdle, and tying in with a lot of the things that we've talked about tonight. When parents feel like they can't teach their kids, but then they want to have them homeschooled, and they bring them home, and they still feel ill-equipped, so they decide to put themselves under the authority of a charter school even when their kids at home. And so I'm interested to read the book, but I haven't. I just jumped in partway this.
Well, yeah, that's okay. We appreciate you joining us, and so I'm going to close here with just a couple of things. So we're, like I said earlier, we're going to have E-Ray Moore on, and so we can listen to him. Ray will probably get us riled up next week, especially about vouchers. And Jennifer, that'll give you, if you're able to, give you a little free time to read, or another week to read, is Public Education Necessary. It's a really good read, and I think quite challenging. So if everyone doesn't mind, I'll just close this here with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll close here. Heavenly Father, I thank you for bringing us all here together this week. We do know that we're delicate beings. You made us that way, but we want to be more reliant on you, especially with discipling our children. We see that is a big obstacle for many people, including us. But we know that you've given us homeschoolers the ability to rely more and more on you. And we thank you for that. We give you all the glory, and we just pray for many more people to be able to rely on you. We do pray for this book club that can bring many more people to thought, Christian thought, your kingdom, and how to advance it. We pray these things in Jesus' name. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us, and then we'll see you next week. Bye, Michelle.